Well, I've been feeling quite overwhelmed recently, and to some extent it's related, I think, to the doom and gloom that I hear, and we all hear, I suppose, wherever we turn. Um, all the videos that I used to watch, or most of them, I just find them to be intolerable. I find nothing of interest, just repetition of what seems to be ceaseless complaining and moaning and being gloomy about the future and about the present. I suppose, it's a new genre that's arisen. And of course, it hasn't arisen in a vacuum. I do understand that there are real um, underpinnings to this general sentiment. But I suppose I just get fed up of hearing it. Doesn't seem to get us anywhere. And it puts me in a bad mood, and it makes me feel overwhelmed, but because the task before me is, whether it's tidying up this workshop, which is the immediate task and I can hardly be bothered, or fixing that guitar that's lurking in the corner for my neighbour, and I promised I'll do it at the weekend, and it's now Sunday afternoon, so I'd better do it. Or whether it's making some sort of weird statement on the internet that can probably wait and isn't important. Um, I think it's better that people don't listen to the things on the internet mainly. Once you've heard, some basic ideas, unless you need specific information for something. Teaching is such a dangerous occupation if that's what it's doing. And we have to be careful what we say, and most people aren't, I'm afraid. That's the trouble. There's only one source of knowledge, and that's the Holy Bible. That's the only one really that you can take and rely upon. But then, you know, being overwhelmed for me also concerned taking the Mazda up to have the underseal put on, and I went to a very big shopping complex outside of the town, outside of Dudley, called Merry Hill, which everybody instantly called Merry Hell when it opened back in the 1970s, no, 1980s maybe. And it was going to be the best thing since sliced bread. And it even had its own little train that you could get on. That was soon taken out of service. And apparently there was every sort of consumer delight on the premises, and miles of covered walkways and arcades. And now that centre is a kind of dystopian nightmare, which is interesting to visit because of that, in a way. It's not quite reached its um, complete destruction, but it's clearly on the way. And so, oddly enough, it's become quite curious, possibly more enjoyable, not quite as heavily frequented perhaps during the week. It's an interesting place, is Merry Hill. Um, why they call Merry Hell, people like that idea of marrying hell to something joyful. It's a popular idea, and I suppose, exposed to it. You start to think, well, what if hell's going to be that place where there's just the bars are open all night and there's prostitutes on the street and all this sort of licentious behavior goes on. Maybe it would be more tolerable than they make out. And there is this idea of hell being merry. But the Bible doesn't bear that out. That's the only problem. And that's another question that I've been struggling with, the nature of hell, and what it truly is. And the fear of hell also, because it does occur to me that, most people that reject Jesus Christ don't fear hell. They don't really believe that there could be such a thing as hell. They think it must be some kind of allegorical, ancient, irrelevant concept. And if it's not, then of course they would perhaps be in trouble, or certainly be in trouble. So is it or isn't it, and how can we test it? There are, many anecdotes of people going to their death and then having a near-death experience, and I think care home workers will probably have some stories to tell of apparent shrieks and ways of passing that seem to be extremely uncomfortable. But my mother had her death throes of, there is such a thing as death throes, and she seemed to be almost so dynamic and so energetic, and it lasted for about 2 days, I should say, before she finally passed. And her limbs had stiffened, and she was just constantly shaking and lost to the world. She was in between life and death, I suppose, during those moments. It was quite. I became used to it after a while. She couldn't really be comforted very easily. She didn't respond to touch. But I spoke, and I read from the Bible as one would do, and it seemed to eventually she was able to pass. So that we all have to face a passing, and we want it to be, as I suppose the transition would. You'd want a smooth one. That would be what I would sign up for. Just give me a smooth transition. And if there's anything that I can do to smooth it over, then I'll do that. It would seem logical. So not to fear the possibility that one wouldn't be able to transition into a place of glory, but rather would be thrust into a place of eternal damnation. Where their worm dieth not, is it Christ that says that? And their thirst and the fire that burns, it sounds just terrible. And the idea of eternity also, that there'd just be no end to it. So that consciousness persists after the grave, and we, as believers, you would know it, I suppose, because that does seem to be quite clearly what we find written in the Bible. But also, you'd have to, that whether if the dead, in unsaved dead, are in agony, then obviously consciousness persists for them too. And if consciousness is going to persist, you'd really want it to be a good thing rather than a bad thing, whereas that one would be absolutely undesirable, of course, and to be avoided at all costs. And I wonder whether people don't turn away from the descriptions of hell in the Bible because they can't be bothered to follow what they consider to be biblical recommendations or something like that. So they think, well, I'm going to carry on going to the pub, even though that means that I better hadn't opened that book. But, that would only be because they, again, they haven't, the Bible has been so poorly taught and interpreted. All the churches teach is work salvation, ultimately. They teach work salvation, and what's more important, I would say, that Christians going to church, or believers going to church, really have to be very careful what they're doing, because there's no ordinance for the creation of a church in Israel in the Bible. And if you look carefully, you'll have to agree with me. And the erection of altars not ordained by God wasn't really very well regarded in the Old Testament when that did occur. You can't just be putting up an altar. Many of those churches are on ancient pagan sites, of course, as the truthers have noted. How appropriate is that? God ordains the place of the temple, not some alien druid people or heathen, or the people who follow the satanic beliefs of the land and the Gaia and all this stuff, and then proceed to sacrifice their firstborn and to have sexual relations with animals and with children. That's the way it is in those ancient religions, you see. And we should erect a church in the place of their own altar of child sacrifice. Is it fitting? I don't know, perhaps so. Was it Gideon that did something like that, perhaps, in the olden days? I don't think a church, though. So the church itself institutionally isn't supported. And anyway, the idea of congregating together, like-minded people, shall we say, in camaraderie, and I understand that it may be comforting and pleasant, and one may enjoy the ritual, but at the same time, the church is more or less universally teaching allegiance to apparent rules created by Paul, because they think that Paul is speaking to us and is laying down the law to us. He is not, of course. He's laying out biblical principles, but Paul is so misunderstood. It's not even funny. Thus transforming the freedom in Christ, which is the true message of Christianity, into a bondage, into a series of petty rules and regulations, they would seem to be. And so Christians start keeping away from pubs and all the rest of it, and withdrawing from the world, and holding themselves apart, getting involved in all sorts of charity, again misunderstanding the true meaning of that word, sadly. There's a lot of resentment. People hold on to a lot of resentment of others, and I see that a lot. People who just won't forgive somebody who's wronged them. Well, you can't forgive somebody who won't ask for forgiveness, as it were. If they have truly wronged you, then they've wronged you, and that stands. But sometimes it's just a question of being a little bit more open-minded, isn't it? Sometimes, I think. We form these presumptions that we don't like this person and we don't like the other person. Whereas the Bible tells us that we should agree quickly. Well, I tried to agree quickly with my neighbour, but he's consistently turned me down, so, I'm in a slightly different position there, but nonetheless, the attempt was made, just for an easy life, not because I'm any better. I don't like hanging on to stuff. It's tiresome. And then, I'm overwhelmed by memories as well, I suppose. Now I start to think back to when I was 18 years old and I started work in the bakery in Oxford, and all the old memories, I have no one to share them with. And they're quite vivid in my mind. So perhaps I could write them down or something like that, just to let go of them a bit more. But I found myself in the middle of this huge commercial complex um, after about 2 hours, and I really, really had no idea where I was, because my mind had been wandering as it does, and I'd been walking around, and I'd been trying to find my way out for some time, and it wasn't going well. And fortunately, one of the kind assistants had seen me clearly in a state of confusion, and this lady came up and gave me reliable directions, and I was able to get out. But I suppose I might have looked a bit funny to some people walking around there. I would have been a bit out of place, and I was lost. I was lost in thought, and of course you come out of a place like that, and it's so big, and there are car parks all around the periphery. So you better remember where you parked that car. Fortunately, I had remembered a key feature of the landscape, and I was able to get back to it eventually. And next door to it was parked another NC Miata, the same generation, and it was gold or dark brown color. It was really nice, with gold wheels. It was parked not exactly next, but in the opposite bay, with just a space between us. And I hung around for a bit to see if the owner might come back, but there was no sign. And so I suppose, my feeling was just that of being very, very tired and overwhelmed by everything lately, just overwhelmed. So I seem to have too much on, too many thoughts running through my mind, and too few resolutions. And I should have come up with the idea that we are involved in this fight against evil, and that we fight against evil by rigorous application of the two great commandments, and also by recognition of the codicil of Jesus when he told us to love also our enemy. I see this as a turning point, and I think one of the first thing that creates is that all conflict in the world ceases. Now, all conflict in your world ceases, obviously, because you don't immediately propagate it to the rest of the world, but it does work a bit like that. That I think the effect would be that, ultimately. A bit like Ice 9 in that Kurt Vonnegut story. I don't know whether anybody has read it. That once a reaction has started, it just propagates and propagates. It becomes unstoppable. And when that happens, then our enemy is revealed. That's the advantage of it. And it's not a small advantage, it's a big one. Because we need to reveal our enemy. We need him to come forward in order, you could say, to prepare for the battle, or in order for him to be removed by one greater than we. But he needs to stand up, and in order to recognize him and to mark him, if it's not our role in the world to remove him, he must be marked. He must be given a mark. Unless he already has one. I don't know. We might recognize it. But I don't know those things. But I think this is the way to go. And it seems to me to be quite an important matter. But, maybe that's just my own conceit. As I said, I've been feeling overwhelmed and some of the symptoms that I've had, you could say, well, that's a bit like, it sounds a bit like Alzheimer's, or you're getting on a bit and your mind is becoming feeble. You could say that. I wouldn't agree with it, but I definitely was needing a bit of assistance in the supermarket that it was very helpful. I think I would have got out eventually, but who can say? God bless.